Tonight we're going to read his fourth dissertation on Av, and it begins with Vinoshantem, which is translated often as "you will grow corrupt," but more accurately it is that you will grow old. And let's see what he says. On the 9th of Av, our brothers throughout the world congregate in the darkened synagogue and take out the book of the covenant to read and to meditate on the thundering words that announce the double catastrophe of 900 years before the first and 1400 years before the second and final destruction of the sanctuary, of the Beis Hamikdash. Long before we entered the Promised Land, many centuries before Rome was even born, Rome that led to Captiva Judea, the name that they gave to Jerusalem.
That's what they called it?
Israel, yeah. To captive Judea. It led it into exile. These words of that's what they gave to the nation of Israel. These words of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, the final book of the Torah, gave us unmistakable notice of the responsibility that we shall shoulder on the very day of our reaching the land. These words teach us also to see God's hand in the many phases of our national destiny, from the time of our independence within our borders, throughout the tribulations of the time of the judges and the kings and the prophets and the rebels, until our downfall, and the plight of our nation, our humiliation, our dispersion. These words also speak of the wondrous protection that will be granted to us throughout our wanderings, facing our enemies and not succumbing to them, enduring against all odds, wounded but surviving, and thus maintaining our national and religious unity in defiance of all the laws of human experience, the miracle of the Jews. Nothing should have a greater impact on our minds than to read that it is not to destroy us that God brings us dispersion and suffering upon us, but to prompt us to return to Him, our joyful obedience and lasting loyalty to His will. This is the ultimate goal that we will reach at the end of the long night of exile. And this goal will be attained, albeit only in Yemotzi Mashiach, at the end of days. May they come soon. Let us recall the words that accompany the day of our national mourning. It's a very important thing to remind ourselves one more time that although we live, Baruch Hashem, at the time of Eretz Yisrael being back in Jewish hands, of the time of so much of Israel being built up, at the time of so many miracles of Israel, that this is not the time that Rav Hirsch lived in. He looked forward to it. How much more so should the words ring in our ears? How close we are. This is the ultimate goal that will be reached at the end of days, at the end of the long night of our exile. This goal will be attained, albeit only in Yemotzi Mashiach, at the end of the days. Let us recall the words that accompany the day of our national mourning. What I'm going to read now is from not this week's Parsha, but next week's Parsha, Devarim. It says, when you have children and children's children, and you will have grown old in the land, as I said, some translate this as corrupt, old in the land, you will degrade yourselves and make an image of any form, and you will do what is evil in the eyes of God, your God, and thus provoke His anger. This is Moshe Rabbeinu, I will call heaven and earth to witness against you that you will be lost quickly from the land where you will settle after the crossing of Jordan. Remember Moshe Rabbeinu standing on the other side of the Jordan, and he's saying, over there is the promise fulfilled. Over there is the land that God promised to Abraham, to Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Right? And now you will inherit it. The promise is about to be kept. But He's looking ahead. And he's saying, God is keeping his promise. He's giving it to you. But you will destroy that promise. You will damage that promise. That you will be lost quickly from the land where you are about to settle, where you will settle after the crossing of the Jordan. You shall not live there for any length of time, but you will be utterly destroyed. And God will scatter you amongst the nations, and you will remain few in number in the midst of all the peoples which God will lead you. And there you will become subservient to the gods that are the work of man's hands, of wood, of stone, which cannot hear, and they cannot eat, and they cannot smell.
It's amazing how that's exactly what happened.
Exactly.
You know, the words of wood and stone, you know who they are. The wood is the Christians, the stone is the Muslims.
It's very interesting. I hadn't heard that, but it makes
wood
sense.
is cross, the stone is the Muslim stone in Mecca.
It's very interesting. I hadn't heard that before, but it's very interesting. And they are far more numerous than we are.
That's what I mean. It's, think how prophetic.
And at this
prophecy,
at this point, it's a moment, of crossing in of great victories before them. You would think that they're on the verge of thinking, we will be a great nation. We'll be a huge nation. We'll grow and be strong. And Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, no.
Yeah.
You'll be a tiny nation. And to this day, we're very influential, but we are very tiny.
Very tiny.
In numbers.
It's amazing.
And you will become subservient to gods that are the work of man's hands, of wood and stone, which cannot hear and cannot smell. From there you will seek God, your God, and you will find him. For you will seek him with all your heart and with all your soul, as it says in the Shema, Vavchem. And all these things will come back upon you. At the end of days, you will turn your back to God, and your God, you will turn back to God, your God, and hear his voice. For God, your God, will remain merciful. He will not abandon you. He will not abandon you completely, nor let you perish. And he will not forget the covenant of your forefathers, which he swore unto them. Right? Each day when we say Shemona Esrei, we remind God, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that we're their sons. And the promise is there. And God never fails, never forgets it. And now, so many years after Moshe Rabbeinu said this to
Yes, unbelievable.
and so many years, more than a century, well, just about, almost a century since Hirsch wrote these words, or Hirsch wrote these words, right? We're beginning to see these things fulfilled. The merciful God is giving us back our land. It's not done yet, and people want to take it from us, right? And some of us seem to want to give it back, sadly, right? But this is a time not to be concerned about negativity among our fellow man, but to rely on God as the Meraglim didn't do. That he will come to our aid, and that we will have this land, and Mashiach will come, and the temple will be rebuilt. Let us consider, this is Hirsch now, for Hirsch. Let us consider more closely one salient thought that is expressed in these sentences that points to the core of our mistakes, of our tragic aberrations. This word is Benoshim Tem. Benoshim Tem. You will grow old. That is the root of evil, growing old. Curious. An age-old tradition finds the numeric value of this word 852. A meaningful reminder of the number of years that we were permitted to live in the land. Indeed, 852 years had passed since the time of the crossing of the Jordan when Joshua, until the year of the destruction of the first temple.
Wow.
At the end of these 852 years, our growing old became the cause of our national deterioration and the end of our independence. The Jewish state foundered on the same cliffs that throughout history became the graveyard of the powerful of this earth. Arrogance, self-confidence, detachment from the very source of man's strength, Hashem, God. You will have grown old in the land. The longer man lives complacently in a satisfying circumstance, the more his origins recede into the past, the more he readily forgets his very beginnings and their conditions. But whether conscious to man or not, he carries with him the commitment to the past to which he owes his present and his future. None be it an individual or a people, can bury the memory with the legacy of the original calling without endangering and finally losing the very identity, the very meaning of human existence that are the marks of a man as an individual or as a group. You can't decide that I am a Jew, but I don't recognize my roots. I don't recognize where I come from. Because what does it mean at that point? You know, Rabbi Breitowitz has often mentioned the idea of pride. You know, there's a gay pride parade. There's even a thing called Jewish pride. Right? So what does it mean to have Jewish pride? What are you proud of? You didn't do anything. Your mother was Jewish and gave birth to you. You're a Jew. Now, Baruch Hashem, somebody who is a ger, a convert, this doesn't apply to. They actually did a great deal to get to that point. But for the rest of us, what's the pride? You know, it's a very big question. Is what does Jewish pride mean when it's inherited through your mother? Right? You know, do we say we have 10-finger pride? I'm proud of my 10 fingers. Yeah. Well, I'm proud of my opposable thumbs. That's very good. No. So what it means to have Jewish pride is exactly what Rav Hirsch is talking about. Right? It's what you do with this inheritance. Right? Do you recognize where it comes from and what its significance is and what its requirements are? And do you fulfill them? And if you do, right, for that, you should have a Jewish pride. But simply for being born of a Jewish mother, you know, gesed hate. That you should do something with it. And this is Rav Hirsch's point. Okay? There is no human condition that does not derive from its past, which contains the secret of its presence, the guarantee of its survival, the fears as well as the hopes for its future. This ironclad rule applies to Israel no less than to every other nation. In Israel's origins, in the well-known and unmistakably communicated terms and conditions of Israel's original assignment among the nations, lies the key for its existence as a proud and respected nation, a carrier of God's word among man. Israel was chosen to have a mission. Every nation has a mission. Right? We have a very specific mission, and it's written out in great detail. And if we choose to ignore that mission, I guess we have to ask the question, what's the purpose of our existence? And I think our history might tell us that part of the purpose of our existence is to recognize the patience of God, who tries to prepare us for that moment when we finally will recognize it. Rav Hirsch will speak about this as we go forward. As soon as Israel forgets, as soon as the aging process takes its toll, its very existence is jeopardized. Israel becomes estranged from the source of its life if it does not recognize any longer the foundation upon which, since days of old, its mere survival and its prosperity and happiness were anchored. Israel sees its sun shining, its fields ripening, its strength growing, nation amongst nations. And the ominous words of the book of the covenant appear on the wall, written by an invisible finger. Woe to him who will have children and children's children and grow old in the land. Become complacent. Think that we have an entitlement that is not based on a covenant. A covenant is two-sided. Hashem fulfills his responsibility, we fulfill ours. We shouldn't expect it to be fulfilled on his side if we fail to do it ourselves. And once again, by the way, in our own lifetime, as I read this, you can visualize the reality. Let's read it again. Israel sees its sun shining, its fields ripening, its strength growing, nation among nations. And the ominous words of the Book of Covenant appear on the wall, written by an invisible finger. Woe to him who will have children and children's children and grow old in the land. We live in a world in which Israel is already fulfilling all of those things. Its produce is world famous. It's a nation among nations, a tiny nation which supplies intellect to the entire world, innovation to the entire world, right? Strength is growing. Everybody remarks that Israel's armed forces are amongst the top armed forces in the world. All of those are happening. And it's at that moment that we should remember this phrase, this fear of complacency. We have to have it, right? Because if we don't, we are for sure doomed.
Yeah, don't forget the real reason.
And if we do, we go on to the next stage. Mashiach himself. The sinister signs of the approaching disaster were visible over the horizon. The armies of the enemy were closing in. Babylon, prepared itself for the final assault, and God called upon the prophet Jeremiah. Go and cry out this message in Yerushalayim to hear. I remember the devotion of your youth, how you loved me as a bride when you followed me into the desert, into the Midbar, in a land unsown. Sacred to God is Israel, the fruit of his harvest of men. Let anyone assail it, and evil will befall him. Thus says God. Yirmiyahu was saying it's possible still. And now, for the days of our loving devotion to God and his will, our closeness to him, only the passing product of our isolation, of our helplessness, of our dissolution in the desert. Why did we become estranged from him? Once we were ourselves the rulers in the land. How could we love him in the Midbar and forsake him
them later
when we get the gift?
852 years later, that's the fall of the first one.
Yeah. Once we reached our potential independence, how could it happen? The answer is we grew old, and the image of our closeness to him became but a vague memory.
Wow.
We had children, children's children, and we grew old.
It's almost like they say when you have a grandfather who builds a business, makes tons of money. The next generation, the father comes in, he doesn't do as well. It's sort of he manages it, and the third generation spends it.
You know, it's
true. Very similar.
What you're saying is a very good observation, but you could ask, why did it happen?
Yeah, that's
right?
the question.
Because the grandfather was very smart, and he understood all the elements of business, and he worked tremendously hard. Right? And he sacrificed it himself in order to pass something on to his children. But one could say that he had a family. He did accumulate all that money, but he somehow failed to pass on his way of life, his understanding, his value system to his son. And once he failed to do it, his son didn't have what to pass on to his son.
Yeah.
And this is, in fact, it's a very good metaphor.
For what happened
because
here?
The description here is that. Yeah, is that...
So our sages didn't teach us properly?
not that our sages, but somewhere along the line, we became complacent.
Wow.
Somewhere along the line, and not that the prophets didn't cry out about this, they did cry out about this. Yeah. They cried out, remember the requirements of Hashem, remember our requirements to each other. The social safety net, the idea of, one God, all of those issues were rooted in prophetic thought and prophetic words, right? So yes, they were crying out against it, right? But we became old. We became forgetful, and more than forgetful, we actually substituted one mythology for the truth. We began to say, well, maybe Baal is the solution. We need a more tangible God to worship. Right? We began to think to ourselves, let him take care of himself. What's the tzedakah? Why am I giving, my best animal to the Beis HaMikdash? I'll give my worst animal. Okay, I'll pray, but, because I have to. All right, why? My father prayed. In this example that you gave. Okay, he showed up at business every morning. His grandfather showed up at business every morning. He showed up at business every morning, right? I'll pray. But will I say my prayers? Will my prayers be filled with a desire for dveikus, for connection to God? Will I mean what I'm saying? Will I even know what I'm saying? Right? It's a big question. Right? So once those things fall away, the rituals can only keep you going for a limited amount of time. Because our relationship with God is not a story. It's not a wonderful, magical process. Right? It is a connection that is built on Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. It's built on the will of God to make a choice of blood. And there's no backing away from it. God has said, you're the ones to do this, and you will do it. Eventually you will do it. You may have to go through a lot to remember that this is your assignment. But you are the ones qualified to do it, and you will do it. And if you forget, I'm going to remind you. And it may not be a very pleasant experience.
A pleasant reminder, yeah. But the shame of loss is incredible.
And it's in here, Hirsch is telling us exactly what Moshe Rabbeinu predicted.
Do you think when Rosha was saying this, is he warning or he's seeing prophecy? He knows this is...
For Hirsch?
No. When Moses was...
it's prophecy, yeah.
He's prophesying. When Moses was saying this, be advised, I know for a fact, because God told me or in prophecy, that in 852 years or whatever, you're going to screw it up. I mean, is he warning them, or he's telling them, I know what's going to happen?
Listen, I think it's a combination of a few things. First of all, Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking his own words at this point. But it says that these were the words of God coming through his mouth. But it's definitely Ruach HaKodesh. He was a prophet, full-time. He didn't have time off from prophecy. So for sure he was speaking the emes, and that he knew it was the emes. But I think there's another element, is if we look through, and I say this with some risk, but I was with some trepidation, some fear. But I think we can look through the history of Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership of the Jewish people. And in his own lifetime, he could observe how many times this people did not appreciate all that they were given. I mean, they had been living for 40 years without doing a day's work.
Yeah, that's right.
They had been living for 40 years without cooking a meal, without taking out the garbage, without going to the washroom. 40 years of having clothes that didn't wear out, that stayed fresh and clean. Shoes that didn't have to go to the shoemaker, that you didn't throw out, right? Climate-controlled environment. You know, they were in the desert. Everybody outside of the clouds of covet around them that were protecting them, you know, was dealing with scorpions and snakes and hills and valleys and heat and whatever. They were traveling around at 72 degrees, you know, perfect humidity.
Good setup.
And in spite of all that, we know that they're complaining all the time.
Yeah, they're always complaining.
They're driving Moshe Rabbeinu crazy.
That caused him to go in.
And you know, that's right. In the end, he's angry, you know, at them. And
it's rocks too much.
It's too much for him at times. So when he's making the statement and he's saying, "This time will come to you," right? He is recognizing that there has been a lot of backsliding even during his
stiff-necked people,
backsliding people during his watch.
Sure.
Imagine without Moshe Rabbeinu. You know, I mean, you know, such a towering figure and such a connection to God. You're going to lose him, and you're still going to maintain. It's actually remarkable that Moshe Rabbeinu, that this group of people maintained it for the 852 years.
Yeah, they did it that far.
But so, why is he saying it? I think he's saying it from a combination. For sure, 100% sure, Emes, Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah. But I think it certainly is consistent with his own personal experience as well.
It's really, really heavy. Yeah. It's just like, as we read it now, it's almost scary, because it literally is exactly what happened.
That's right. And it could happen, sadly, it could happen again.
Yeah.
We have the land now.
Yes.
What are we doing with it? The Nosham Tem. The Nosham Tem from Yeshon and Zachan identifies the human being who is ripened, who has gained maturity, that will increase with the number of years. In contrast, Ishan is, in contrast, related closely to somewhat differently vocalized term which signifies asleep. So it's made up of one word that implies maturity and wisdom, another word, asleep, is indeed the expression for aging, weakening, progressively losing the strength of the body and mind. Right? That is to say, the nation develops Alzheimer's, in a way.
Sure.
It forgets, it can't recognize. You know, it has moments of recognition, right? But most of the time, it doesn't really, it's wandering around in its own, where is God? Right? What is God? Thus, this word becomes synonymous with the transition to the final dissolution, to the disintegration of the nation and possibly to death. How often do human enterprises begin with enthusiasm, joy, and hope, only to give way to disappointment or frustration? This will, however, only occur if the beginning was not distinguished by a genuine, solid motivation, by deep-rooted convictions, and by all the seriousness that a major human decision requires. We have seen human alliances between nations or between individuals that begin to waver after the first difficulties, and they will finally crumble, unable to withstand the test of years. And we, Israel, twice a day, in the morning at our awakening and in the evening when the day comes to a close, we recite the Shema, and we conclude with the evocation of the exodus from Egypt, Yetziras Mitzrayim, our oldest national experience, oldest but also eternally present in our Jewish consciousness. Every day we go out from Egypt, together with our forefathers. Every day we face the threat of the seas and the menace of the enemy. Every day, with undiminished fervor, Israel and our prayers are preceded by the evocation of the liberation of Yetziras Mitzrayim, of the dream of the Geula of Geulas. Our minds, our thoughts should never, never lose their close links with the time of our youth, when we followed Hashem into the Midbar. Our material achievements should at all times evidence the stamp of our beginning, and thus forever protect us from the arrogance of wealth and moral danger of unbridled and uncontrolled ownership. Shabbos reminds us that God is, was, and shall always be the only provider for our needs. God the Creator, God the Master. Week after week, Shabbos affixes the signature of the Master on our human accomplishments, because this land is mine. For only sojourners and tenants are you with me. Thus we have become fully consciousness throughout our Jewish destiny of the moral danger contained in our growing old. We also carry with us the ineffable remedy, the eternal source of rejuvenation, really the kind of fountain of youth, our true and lasting regeneration, the source of our joy that takes its essence from the majestic sound of the shofar that resounded from Sinai. Teruah. The science of divine teaching is awaiting us every day, every hour, not only in scrolls and inscription on stones was Torah given to us, but foremost in living words spoken by the living God to every man, in living communication between master and pupil, will Torah be transmitted from generation to generation. That really is our youth, is our ability to pass on the fire, the fervor.
And they say Torah's life, right? That was the...
Absolutely. Right. It's Chaim, you should grasp onto it, the tree of life. The two eternal foundations of our national and individual existence demand to be learned and studied, to be explored in their very depth by the continued interchange between old and young, between teacher and student. Learning demands youthful freshness, memory, dedication. The entire nation, generation after generation, became the carrier of Torah and thus acquired the maturity of a zachan, together with the acuity of Israel's secret to eternal youth. I knew a family in which the grandfather, in his later years, in his 90s, had memory trouble. And sometimes he couldn't remember the names of all his grandsons. But he could open up a lot of a Gemara with any of his grandsons and learn it and teach it over to him. That it had kept his mind vibrant. And we know, this is what Hirsch tells us, and we know this to be true, but science tells us too. How does it tell us to avoid the degeneration in the mind of old age? To use the mind. How do we strengthen our muscles? Through use.
Use them.
How do we prevent the onset of old age to our minds?
Keep learning.
Keep learning. Keep the mind active and learning. Yeah. What's the best thing to learn?
Torah and commandments, it's all logic.
Because why? Because no matter how much you learn Torah, you're scratching the surface. Because it's godly and it's infinite, right? So you can't come to the end of it. You can go through, we're coming now to the conclusion of a 7.5-year cycle of Sima Shas, the completion of the Gemara, and it's a wonderful time. So we finished it. We're done. Finished it. I don't have to learn anymore. No. You get to start the new cycle, and in the new cycle you will learn things you didn't learn in the previous cycle from exactly the same page. It will be there. Learning demands youthful freshness, memory, dedication. The entire nation, generation to generation, became the carrier of Torah and acquired the maturity of a zachan, a sage, together with the acuity of the young, Israel's secret to eternal life. So somehow they both were combined, right? The quality of a great sage and the youth and energy were together. The very substance of Torah encompasses indeed all facets of human life, the reality of human society, the history and nature. It leads the way to the discovery of God's truth, of God's justice, of God's mercifulness. Nothing describes better the unique power of Torah, the transformation that engenders in man, than the sentence that concludes the encounter of God and Israel on Sinai. And all the people saw and heard the sounds. Our sages interpret the convocation of men and women assembled at the foot of the mountain did participate in this unique event not only with their senses, but with the faculty of perception that had expanded far beyond the ordinary. They saw what one can only hear, and they heard what one can only see, meaning they saw the sounds of God's voice, and they heard the letters of the Torah. Imagine someone says, you heard lightning and you saw thunder.
Yeah. Okay.
What does it mean?
Yeah, what does it mean?
What does it mean that you should be able to see in a stone letters on both sides carved, and somehow the correct both sides? All those are consistent.
Yeah, amazing.
With that in mind. Our sages interpret. Is not Torah more than mere teaching a science of purely theoretical value? Is it not the unique guide through every conceivable situation, every possible conflict, every constellation that will present itself to our searching spirit? Is it not the God-given illumination of the darkness that threatens to engulf our lives? Indeed, these teachings are shaping our will and are providing us with the ideal of self-fulfillment. They give us the yardstick to measure our true and lasting achievements, so that we will be able to follow our shepherd with youthful strength and resolution. So it's very important point is here. We need a yardstick, because we might think that our fulfillment is the wrong things. So the Torah tells us what is of value and what is not. There is no doubt the Torah was given to us to shield us from the curse of growing old. We don't have to grow old. Torahs and mitzvahs were given to us to preserve an immortal nation in the midst of the peoples of the world who, without exception, will fall victim to the assault of history, of old age. But we don't have to. We see nation upon nation rise, conquer, be a world power, a success, and then either suddenly or slowly leave the face of the earth to become virtually non-existent. We don't have to repeat the names of Babylon, of Rome, of all the nations of Greece that had their glory, of Syria that came and went. And you can go on with a very long list, right? But one nation retains its vitality. One nation retains its law. One nation retains the root of its existence, its connection to God. Because why? Because we are part of God's plan of fulfillment, and because there is a core of us who continue to do this.
There's a famous, I'm not sure what it is, but some king said how you prove the existence of God or the thing, and his advisor says to the king, the Jews, sir, the Jews.
That's right. The Jews are
eternal.
Are the proof that God exists, because there is no sense to the fact that they continue to exist. No military power, not a large population, sometimes wealthy, sometimes poor, no political power, right? None of those things over the ages, and they continue. What is their strength? A book? Some pieces of paper? Their strength is the book, is the connection to the creative force of the universe. And there's a covenant that exists between that force, which we call God, and his people, who here on earth are required to fulfill his will, and in doing so have his support and protection. And so, unlike others, not only do we not have to grow old, but we must not grow old. But alas, we only had contempt for God and His mitzvahs. We abandoned the Torah. We became the hapless witness of our national disaster, twice repeated within 6 centuries. Our paradise on earth closed its gates behind us. In the land of our enemies, we found the way back to Torah and mitzvahs. It was Torah and mitzvahs which saved us from the fire that consumed the temple and the towns. Torah and mitzvahs remain the inalienable essence of our life for Israel in our time, in the future, as it was in the past. Can we risk again to ignore the warning? You will have children, and your children's children will grow old. And that's how this chapter ends. That's how the chapter ends. Can we ignore the warning? You will have children, and your children's children, and you will grow old. A generation filled with fire, filled with idealism, lit the world with inspiration at the end of the war, and made the desert to bloom, made the nation to come alive. Israel, which was a wasteland, became a Garden of Eden, became green. You know, you can see how every flower, every plant is nourished by love and concern when you're in the land of Israel. And you can see what happens where the Jews are not taking care of it. It's ruinous, absolutely ruinous. We're given the opportunity, we can see what we can have. But where did that dream go? That fire, that zeal that conquered the land, that made that conquered natural forces of swamps, of disease, of dysentery, of terrible things that were killing people, right? Typhus, right? You know, not to mention just sheer dryness and heat. Right? We overcame all of those things, right? And we overcame it with a tremendous zealousness. And now it seems that there's an element where that's been forgotten. People are saying, why should we serve? Why should we have a role? It's not appropriate. We should serve, we have to serve, and those of us who are not in the land have to find a way to serve the land, to be part of it, right? Lest we become old, lest we develop a kind of mental illness that comes with age. I don't want to say Alzheimer's, but a kind of forgetfulness of what is it?
A malaise.
You know, a malaise. How? Not just a malaise. A malaise implies I'm kind of bored, not active.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's much worse than that.
It's worse. Yeah.
You know, we have the land of Israel in front of us. Some of us live outside the land. Some of us live in the land. And tragically, this issue that Rav Hirsch describes exists in both places, and there's evidence of it in both places. In the land, we see those children of the pioneers have lost the will. Very much say, let's be like everybody else.
I don't even religious. They have zero knowledge of the...
Many were not. I don't want to actually get into, but I want to get into the connection to the land itself. Right? And I don't really even think that there's any evil connected to it. And this is actually Rav Hirsch's point, is that Alzheimer's is not something that comes from evil behavior. It comes from the lack of rigorous good behavior, one would argue. If one of the cures of Alzheimer's is mental activity, then lack of it is one of the causes of it. And what are the symptoms? One of the symptoms is you actually don't recognize what is familiar to you. So here you are in the middle of a land of miracles, and you want it to be like every other land? Why? It should be a land of miracles, as God intended it to be. But somehow you've forgotten that. And you're living there. Are you willing to commit your life to protecting it? Maybe yes, maybe no. If you understood what it was, there would be no maybe. You'd run to serve. What about us here? Where is our running? Could ask the question, right? And it's a very serious problem. Very serious problem, because our home is there, inevitably. But every year, more and more Jews who live outside of Israel, we hear wonderful stories of Aliyah. Nefesh B'Nefesh, different organizations that encourage Aliyah, that help Aliyah. But very often we read very disheartening polls where large groups of Jews are being polled and say that Israel, it's not an issue for me either way. I don't feel strongly about it. They've forgotten in such a short time how nation upon nation closed their doors. The Cuba was more open to Jews during the Second World War than Canada or the United States.
Cuba
was. The idea of one is too many as an immigration policy, when people are being slaughtered by the tens of thousands, the millions. We've forgotten Antibes, where they took us and they separated us from the non-Jews and said they're the ones we want. And the long arm of Israel reached across the sea, reached across the continent, and saved those people when nobody else would. We've forgotten that Iraq built a nuclear plant that Saddam Hussein would have someday used against the world, and against all of the condemnation of the nations, Israel's military flew and destroyed it. These are things that cannot happen without your own land. There's a protection afforded to us by our land. And that a Jew can wake up in the morning and say, Israel, I'm concerned about the economy. Israel's not an issue. Israel is our lifeblood. We're connected to it. If we don't want to be connected to it, our enemies will connect us to it. So I think this is a time of year to be thinking about our connection to every Jew, religious and not religious, Sephardi and Ashkenaz, Hasidish and Yeshivish, observant and non-observant, and know that we are linked by blood, we are linked by a history, and we are linked by a future. And that future, God willing, will be a glorious future. The next year, when we're together learning Hirsch, we'll be learning about the Feast of Tisha B'Av. Yeah. And we'll be learning about it in Eretz Yisrael, with the temple rebuilt in Messianic times, and the crying over the lost temple will be just a dim history, and we'll be living in the world that we imagine has the potential to be. It should come immediately in our days.
Amen.
Amen.